There are certain evenings that remain vivid in my memory, even after the passing of many peaceful years. They were not always the evenings filled with the greatest danger, nor those that brought Sherlock Holmes the highest praise. Rather, they linger because they carried a quiet feeling that something unusual had begun, though neither of us yet understood where it would lead. The affair, which later became known as the resident patient, began on just such an evening. It was a damp October day in London. Rain had fallen steadily since morning, washing the streets until they reflected the warm glow of the gas lamps. A cool mist drifted between the buildings, softening the outlines of passing carriages and hurrying pedestrians. From our familiar rooms at 2021B Baker Street came the comforting crackle of the fire, which filled the sitting room with gentle warmth, while the weather outside seemed determined to keep the city wrapped in gray. Many years have passed since those comfortable days, yet I can still picture Holmes exactly as he appeared that evening. He lay stretched upon the sofa, quietly reading a letter that had arrived with the morning post. I could not say how many times he had already studied it, for my friend possessed the curious habit of discovering fresh meaning each time he examined a document. As for myself, I had attempted to entertain my mind with the day's newspaper. It proved a disappointing companion. Parliament had risen, society had departed for country estates, and the remaining news seemed remarkably dull. I folded the paper with a sigh and settled back into my chair beside the fireplace. Had my purse been fuller, I might have escaped London for a few days beside the sea. Instead, I remained quite content in Baker Street, where the warmth of the fire and the company of Holmes offered comforts of their own. Holmes, unlike myself, never longed for the countryside. He believed that nowhere in England could equal London for endless fascination. Within its crowded streets, every stranger carried a story, every passing face concealed a history, and every ordinary day possessed the possibility of becoming extraordinary. For several peaceful minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, the occasional settling of the burning coals, and the distant rumble of carriage wheels upon the wet streets below. My thoughts drifted quietly from one subject to another, without any particular purpose. Then, without warning, Holmes broke the silence. "You are perfectly right, Watson," he remarked in his calm voice. "It is indeed a most unreasonable way for settling disagreements." Stared at him in complete surprise. "I beg your pardon?" I asked. Holmes lowered his letter and smiled faintly. "You were reflecting upon warfare," he said, "more precisely, upon how civilized nations continued to settle their disputes." I could only shake my head. "My dear Holmes," I replied, "I had not spoken a single word." "No," said he pleasantly, "you had no need to." Little did I know where Holmes's remarkable observation would soon lead, or that before another day had passed, a troubled physician would arrive at our door, seeking help for a mystery unlike any we had encountered before. For a few moments, I simply looked at Holmes across the room, unable to understand how he had reached such a conclusion. The firelight danced across his sharp features, while the rain continued its gentle tapping against the windows. He appeared perfectly relaxed, as though there were nothing remarkable in having spoken aloud the very thought that had occupied my own silent mind. "You astonish me more with every passing year," I admitted. Holmes folded the letter neatly and placed it upon the small table beside the sofa. "My dear Watson," said he, "there is nothing supernatural about the matter. Observation and reason are merely habits, and habits grow stronger with practice. I had not moved, I replied. I had scarcely even changed my expression. I assure you that you did both. His eyes sparkled with quiet amusement as he settled more comfortably in his chair. You threw aside your newspaper with obvious disappointment. That alone suggested your thoughts were beginning to wander. A few moments later, your attention rested upon the framed portrait hanging opposite the fireplace. I turned instinctively toward the wall, where the picture still hung. You then glanced toward another portrait which remained unframed upon the bookshelf. It was perfectly natural that you should compare the two. I smiled. I confess, I was thinking exactly that. Holmes nodded. The unframed portrait reminded you of the man himself. Your expression altered slightly as memories returned. Since I know your admiration for General Gordon and your interest in the American preacher, Henry Ward Beecher, I found the path of your thoughts remarkably easy to follow. He spoke gently, never with the slightest trace of vanity. Your eyes remained fixed for several seconds, then your features became thoughtful. I knew you were recalling Beecher's speeches during the American Civil War. The memory returned to me exactly as he described it. I remembered reading about the hostility he faced while speaking in England, I admitted. Precisely. Holmes leaned forward and rested his fingertips together. That naturally carried your mind toward the war itself. Your face grew more solemn. Your hand drifted almost unconsciously toward the old wound you received during your military service in Afghanistan. Again, I looked down in surprise. My fingers had indeed settled upon the scar hidden beneath my sleeve. You reflected upon the terrible cost of war, Holmes continued quietly. Then a faint smile appeared as you considered how strange it is that civilized nations still settle disagreements by sending thousands of young men into battle. He paused for a moment. I merely expressed agreement with your conclusion. I laughed softly despite my amazement. When you explain your reasoning, I said, it all appears wonderfully simple. It usually is. But before the explanation, it seems impossible. Holmes smiled. That is because the human mind notices very little of what the eyes actually see. Most people observe only what attracts their attention. They fail to notice everything else. His words remained with me long afterward. Throughout our years together, I often witnessed remarkable deductions, yet they almost always rested upon ordinary details that everyone else had overlooked. The room grew quieter as evening settled over Baker Street. Outside, the steady rain gradually weakened until only an occasional drop struck the window panes. Somewhere below, a carriage rolled slowly through the street before disappearing into the growing mist. Holmes rose from the sofa, stretched lazily, and walked toward the window. It appears the weather has finally taken pity upon London, he observed. I joined him. The clouds were beginning to break, allowing a cool breeze to sweep along Baker Street. The gas lamps glowed more brightly now that darkness had arrived, and their warm light reflected upon the rain-soaked pavement like ribbons of gold. "A walk, Watson?" Holmes asked. I welcomed the suggestion immediately. There were few pleasures greater than wandering through London beside Sherlock Holmes when no urgent case demanded his attention. During such walks, his mind seemed wonderfully free. He spoke not only of crime, but of architecture, history, science, music, and the endless variety of human character. We left the familiar comfort of Baker Street and made our way toward the Strand, where the evening crowds still filled the streets. Gentlemen hurried home beneath dark umbrellas. Shopkeepers extinguished lamps one by one as their businesses closed for the night. Newspaper boys called the final editions, while hansom cabs rattled steadily over the shining stones. Holmes noticed everything. A clerk carrying flowers instead of his usual briefcase, a sailor who had only recently returned from abroad, the gentleman whose polished boots had somehow collected fresh country mud. Each small detail became the beginning of a quiet explanation, and I listened with the same enjoyment I had known since first making his acquaintance. Nearly 3 hours passed in this pleasant fashion before we finally turned once more toward Baker Street. The streets had grown calmer. A thin veil of fog drifted between the buildings, softening the glow of the gas lamps. The city itself seemed ready for sleep. As we approached our lodging, Holmes slowed his pace. A single horse-drawn brougham stood waiting outside number 201B. He examined it for scarcely more than a heartbeat. "We have a visitor," he remarked. "A patient?" I asked. "No." I looked again, but could discover nothing unusual. "A medical gentleman," Holmes continued, "recently established in practice, though already enjoying respectable success." I smiled. "You have reached all that from one passing glance?" "The answer hangs quite plainly inside the carriage." Only then did I notice the neatly arranged medical bag resting upon the seat within. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Our evening, I think, is about to become rather more interesting." At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already noticed. Mrs. Hudson admitted us only a moment later, and together Holmes and I entered our familiar sitting room. The fire still burned brightly upon the hearth, casting a warm glow across the bookshelves and comfortable chairs. Our visitor rose immediately as we entered. He was a man, perhaps 34 years of age, though care and long hours of work had given him an older appearance. His face was pale, and his light beard was neatly trimmed. His dark coat was plain, but well cared for, and there was something reserved about his manner which suggested a gentleman more at ease among books and crowded drawing rooms. His long, slender hands especially caught my attention. It were the hands of a physician, accustomed to careful examination rather than physical labor. Holmes greeted him warmly. "Good evening, Doctor. I trust we've not kept you waiting very long." The visitor offered a tired smile. "Only a few minutes, Mr. Holmes." Holmes removed his coat and motioned toward the chair beside the fireplace. "Please make yourself comfortable." As the gentleman sat down once more, I studied him more closely. His face carried an unmistakable expression of anxiety. It was not the fear of immediate danger, but rather the quiet exhaustion of someone whose peace of mind had slowly been worn away. The dancing firelight softened the room, making it feel wonderfully sheltered from the damp London evening outside. "I believe," I said, after a moment, "that I recognize your name." The visitor looked pleasantly surprised. "I am Dr. Percy Trevelyan." I nodded. "Then I have indeed heard of your work. Some years ago, I read your monograph concerning obscure diseases of the nervous system. If I remember correctly, it attracted considerable attention among medical men." A faint flush of satisfaction crossed his pale cheeks. I had almost begun to think no one remembered it. "I assure you it was highly regarded." He bowed his head modestly. "It was written during happier days," he replied quietly. Holmes had been observing our visitor with his usual thoughtful expression. At last he lit his pipe and settled comfortably into his chair. "My friend has already introduced you by reputation," said Holmes. "Now perhaps you will tell us what has brought you to Baker Street." Trevelyan clasped his hands together for a moment before speaking. "The circumstances are rather unusual, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled gently. "Those are precisely the circumstances that generally find their way here." The doctor's anxious face relaxed slightly. "I hope you will forgive me if I begin with a little of my own history. Without it, the events of the last few days would make very little sense." Holmes inclined his head. "Please proceed in your own way." The doctor drew a slow breath. I studied medicine at the University of London, where I devoted nearly all my attention to diseases of the nervous system. My professors were generous in their encouragement, and after qualifying, I remained attached to King's College Hospital, continuing my research. As a fellow physician, I found myself listening with genuine interest. My greatest interest, he continued, was a rare condition known as catalepsy. Cases were extremely uncommon, making careful study very difficult. Still, I devoted several years to gathering observations and recording every detail I could. The fire crackled softly as he spoke. Eventually, I'll publish my findings. I remember the work, I said. It earned you the Bruce Pinkerton Prize. A modest smile appeared once again. It did. For a young physician, I continued, that was a remarkable achievement. I was fortunate. He spoke without pride. Many senior physicians predicted that I might build a distinguished career. He paused for a moment before giving a quiet sigh. Unfortunately, medicine demands more than knowledge. Holmes nodded slowly. Money. Exactly. The doctor looked toward the flames before continuing. I possessed ambition, education, and determination. What I lacked was capital. His words carried no bitterness, only simple honesty. To establish oneself as a specialist in London's West End required far more than I could possibly afford. There were expensive consulting rooms to rent, furniture to purchase, servants to employ, and many months, perhaps years, during which few patients might appear. I understood his position perfectly. Many gifted young doctors had seen promising careers delayed simply because they lacked the financial means to begin. I calculated, said Dr. Trevelyan, that if I lived very carefully and saved nearly every pound I earned, it might take 10 years before I could establish the sort of practice I desired. Outside, wind stirred gently against the windows. It seemed an impossible distance. He folded his hands together once more. Then, quite unexpectedly, my future changed in the course of a single morning. Holmes leaned forward slightly. A gentleman called upon me. The doctor's voice grew quieter. He introduced himself as Mr. Blessington. The name meant nothing to me at the time, yet I noticed Holmes's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. He was entirely unknown to me. Without any introduction whatever, he entered my rooms, sat down, and immediately began asking the most extraordinary questions. Dr. Trevelyan gave a faint smile at the memory. He wished to know whether I possessed intelligence. An unusual beginning, Holmes observed. I assured him that I hoped so. He then asked whether I had good judgment, and I answered as honestly as I could. Holmes smiled. I imagine that satisfied him, no more than the first answer. Not at all. The doctor allowed himself a brief laugh. His next question was whether I drank heavily. I could not help smiling myself. I imagine that startled you. Very much. Yet, Holmes remarked quietly, he was not really asking about drink. No. Dr. Trevelyan nodded thoughtfully. He wished to discover whether I possessed self-control. The room fell silent for a moment. Only after satisfying himself upon these curious points did Mr. Blessington reveal the astonishing proposal that would alter the whole course of my life. Little did I know that the mysterious gentleman called Blessington would soon stand at the very center of one of the most extraordinary cases Sherlock Holmes had ever investigated. Dr. Percy Trevelyan paused for a moment, as though the memory itself still seemed remarkable after all the years that had passed. Outside, the rain had almost ceased, leaving only the occasional drip of water from the rooftops into the quiet street below. The warm glow of our fire made the contrast with the damp London evening all the more comforting. Holmes remained perfectly still, his fingertips pressed lightly together as he listened. "I confess," said the doctor, "that I had never met anyone quite like Mr. Blessington." He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. The gentleman wasted no time on ordinary conversation. He did not ask about my family, nor my ambitions, nor even my medical research. Instead, he questioned me as though he were examining an investment. Holmes gave a slight nod. "A practical man." "Entirely so," Dr. Trevelyan continued. He had already satisfied himself that I possessed professional ability. He now wished to know whether I possessed enough discipline to make success of it. The doctor smiled faintly. Once he appeared content with my answers, he leaned forward in his chair and spoke with complete confidence. His voice softened as he recalled the strange meeting. He said that he wished to finance my medical practice. I raised my eyebrows. That must have come as an extraordinary surprise. It certainly did. I could scarcely believe I had heard him correctly. The physician looked toward the fire. He explained that they possessed several £1,000s available for investment. Rather than placing the money in business or property, he intended to invest it in a young doctor. Holmes quietly drew upon his pipe, but offered no interruption. I naturally asked why he should choose me. "What answer did he give?" I inquired. He replied that every investment carries some degree of risk, but in his opinion, a hard-working physician with an excellent reputation was safer than most commercial ventures. The explanation sounded unusual, yet not entirely unreasonable. He proposed to lease a respectable house in Brook Street, Dr. Trevelyan continued. He would furnish it completely, employ servants, purchase everything necessary for a successful consulting practice, and meet every expense. I could well appreciate what such an offer meant to an ambitious young specialist. "All I was expected to do," said the doctor, "was devote myself entirely to my patients, and in return?" Holmes asked. "I would receive 1/4 of the income earned by the practice. The remaining 3/4 would belong to Mr. Blessington until he had recovered his investment, and beyond." I reflected upon the arrangement. Seems rather generous on his part. So it appeared. It seemed almost too fortunate to be genuine. "I imagine you made careful inquiries." I did. "What did you discover?" "Very little." The answer seemed almost apologetic. No one appeared to know much about Mr. Blessington. He possessed sufficient funds, paid his bills promptly, and lived quietly. Beyond that, he remained something of a mystery. Holmes' eyes remained fixed upon our visitor. "And yet, you accepted." "I did." The doctor spoke without hesitation. "My alternatives were few. Without assistance, I might have waited 10 years before opening the practice I desired. Mr. Blessington offered me the opportunity immediately. It was difficult to blame him. Many gifted physicians never achieved the careers they deserved, simply because they lacked financial support at the beginning. So, Dr. Trevelyan continued, we entered into a formal agreement. Within a matter of weeks, the house in Brook Street had been secured and elegantly furnished. A consulting room occupied the ground floor, together with a waiting room for patients. Upstairs were private apartments, while the servants managed the household with quiet efficiency. The location proved ideal, he said. Brook Street already enjoyed an excellent reputation among London's medical community. Wealthier patients preferred physicians established in that fashionable district, and before long the doctor's name began to attract increasing attention. My earlier research had earned me a modest reputation, he explained. Soon a number of difficult neurological cases found their way to my door. The practice prospered almost from the beginning. I considered myself extraordinarily fortunate. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. So your benefactor's speculation proved successful. Very successful. The doctor smiled briefly. Within only a few years, the practice exceeded every expectation. Yet, as he spoke those words, the smile disappeared. There remained one peculiarity. Holmes leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Mr. Blessington himself. The doctor's voice grew quieter. He insisted upon living in the same house. As a resident? Yes. He explained that his own heart was in poor condition, and that he required regular medical supervision. He occupied the finest sitting room and bedroom on the first floor, and referred to himself, half in jest, as my resident patient. The title, unusual as it sounded, remained entirely harmless. At least, so it first appeared. Did he often require treatment? Holmes asked. Very little. The doctor shook his head. His physical complaints were surprisingly few. His habits, however, were unlike those of any patient I had ever known. He rarely entertained visitors. He almost never left the house except for one carefully timed walk each afternoon. He disliked strangers. He distrusted nearly everyone. Most curious of all, every evening at precisely the same hour, he entered the consulting room after my last patient had departed. He examined the account books himself, said Dr. Trevelyan. He calculated every fee with remarkable precision before dividing the income exactly according to our agreement. Not a single evening was missed. Whether business had been good or poor, whether rain or sunshine filled the streets of London, Blessington followed the same routine with unwavering accuracy. He would place my share quietly upon the desk, the doctor continued, and carry the remainder upstairs to a large black strong box which never left his bedroom. The image lingered in my mind, a wealthy man living almost like a prisoner, guarding his money with constant vigilance. At the time, however, Trevelyan believed these habits to be nothing more than harmless eccentricities. Neither he nor I could yet imagine that behind Blessington's cautious manner lay a secret from the past, one that had patiently waited for many years before returning to claim its debt. At that time, Holmes alone seemed to suspect that the curious resident patient was hiding far more than simple nervousness. As Dr. Trevelyan finished describing the unusual arrangement he shared with Mr. Blessington, a thoughtful silence settled over our sitting room. Holmes remained motionless in his chair, his pipe resting lightly between his fingers, while thin streams of smoke drifted lazily upward toward the ceiling. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The damp streets below reflected the golden glow of the gas lamps, and now and then the quiet rumble of a passing carriage reached us through the windows. It was certainly an uncommon partnership, Holmes observed at last. It was, replied the doctor. Yet for nearly 3 years everything passed peacefully. His practice flourished beyond his earliest hopes. Patients came from every part of London, particularly those suffering from uncommon disorders of the nervous system. The reputation he had earned through careful study continued to grow, and each passing month brought fresh success. Blessington, he continued, had every reason to be satisfied with his investment. And were you? I asked. Entirely. Although his manner could sometimes be abrupt, he always honored our agreement. I had no complaints. For a time, life in Brook Street followed the same quiet routine each day. Patients arrived throughout the morning and afternoon. The servants managed the household efficiently. At the appointed hour each evening, Blessington would appear in the consulting room, carefully inspect the account books, divide the day's earnings, and carry his share upstairs to the large black strong box in his bedroom. His habits were almost mechanical. He disliked change, said Dr. Trevelyan. Everything happened at the same hour and in the same order. Holmes gave a slight nod. Routine often provides comfort to nervous men. I believe it did. The doctor paused before continuing. Then several weeks ago, everything altered. His voice became noticeably quieter. It began after a newspaper reported a burglary in the West End. I waited for him to continue. The crime itself seemed entirely ordinary, yet after reading the account, Blessington became strangely agitated. In what way? Holmes asked. He immediately insisted that additional bolts should be fitted to every door and window in the house. An unusual reaction? Quite so. According to the doctor, Blessington examined every lock personally. He questioned the servants repeatedly about securing the house before bedtime and became anxious whenever anyone left a door unlocked, even for a few moments. He behaved as though he expected someone to force their way inside. Did he explain why? Holmes asked. I questioned him several times, and he merely referred to the burglary reported in the newspaper. The explanation had seemed unsatisfactory even then. A burglary committed elsewhere hardly justified such extraordinary precautions. No. Dr. Trevelyan slowly shook his head. It seemed to me that the newspaper report had reminded him of something far more personal. During the following week, Blessington's behavior became increasingly peculiar. He abandoned his daily walks altogether. Instead of enjoying the fresh air before dinner, he remained indoors, wandering nervously from window to window. More than once, he drew back the curtains only a few inches and stared silently into the street below. He seemed to be watching for someone, said the doctor. Or perhaps fearing someone, Holmes quietly remarked. I believe that is nearer the truth. The servants noticed the change as well. Even ordinary sounds within the house appeared to disturb him. A sharp knock at the front door, unexpected footsteps upon the staircase, the sudden ringing of the bell. Each caused him to start violently before recovering himself. It was painful to witness. Trevelyan admitted. He scarcely slept. His appetite diminished. His nerves appeared completely shattered. Naturally, the doctor attempted to discuss the matter. I reminded him that prolonged anxiety damaged his health. Did he accept your advice? I asked. For a moment, I thought he might. Instead, Blessington became unexpectedly angry. He insisted that I should mind my own affairs. The memory clearly troubled Dr. Trevelyan. He apologized later for his harshness, but refused to offer any explanation. Holmes quietly tapped the bowl of his pipe against the edge of the fireplace. So whatever frightened him, he said thoughtfully, was something he dared not discuss. That was certainly my impression. As the days passed, however, Blessington gradually appeared to regain his composure. His walks resumed. The servants noticed that he smiled occasionally. Once more, the extra bolts remained upon the doors, but otherwise, life seemed to return to normal. I began to believe the strain episode had passed. The doctor sighed softly. I was entirely mistaken. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully withdrew a folded sheet of paper. 2 days ago, he said, placing it gently upon Holmes's table, this letter arrived. Holmes picked it up without unfolding it immediately. There was no address, Dr. Trevelyan explained, and no date. The anonymous letter requested an appointment for a wealthy Russian nobleman who was said to suffer from repeated attacks of catalepsy. Knowing of Dr. Trevelyan's published work on the rare disorder, the writer wished to arrange a consultation at precisely 6:15 on the following evening. As you may imagine, the doctor continued, I found the request extremely interesting. Catalepsy was among the rarest conditions known to medicine. A physician might spend many years without encountering a genuine case. I accepted the appointment immediately. Holmes carefully folded the letter once more. and laid it upon the table. His expression had changed very little, yet I had lived beside him long enough to recognize the quiet concentration behind those calm gray eyes. At that time I could not yet understand what Holmes had already begun to suspect, nor how closely the mysterious letter was connected to the fear that had slowly taken hold of Mr. Blessington's life. Holmes unfolded the letter once more and read it slowly from beginning to end. When he had finished, he placed it carefully upon the table beside his pipe, without offering an opinion. I had learned long ago that silence often meant his mind was busiest. Dr. Trevelyan watched him anxiously. "It appeared to be an ordinary professional request," said the doctor. Nothing in the wording seemed unusual, except perhaps that the writer gave neither name or address. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "That is curious, but not impossible. Wealthy patients sometimes value their privacy." That was my own conclusion. The doctor leaned back in his chair, his hands resting quietly upon his knees. "I was particularly interested because the gentleman claimed to suffer from catalepsy. As a physician myself, I understood his excitement. Few medical conditions were as uncommon. Many doctors spent their entire careers without seeing a genuine attack. My published research had dealt almost entirely with that disorder," Dr. Trevelyan continued. "Naturally, I hoped that examining such a patient might increase my understanding." He smiled faintly. "I spent much of the following day reviewing my previous notes." Outside, the last traces of rain had disappeared. The city had settled into one of those calm London evenings when the streets seemed wrapped in gentle mist. Through our window came the distant sounds of carriage wheels and the muffled voices of late pedestrians making their way home beneath the glowing gas lamps. At precisely 6:15 the following evening, the front bell rang. "My page showed the visitors upstairs," said the doctor. The first gentleman to enter was elderly, thin, and plainly dressed. Nothing about his appearance suggested the wealthy Russian nobleman described in the letter. His face was pale, his movements slow, and his expression rather vacant. Had I passed him in the street, I should have taken him for an ordinary traveler, rather than a man of considerable rank. "He spoke English," said Dr. Trevelyan, though with a noticeable foreign accent. Holmes listened without interruption. The second visitor attracted far more attention. The doctor's voice became slightly more animated. He was a remarkably handsome young man, broad-shouldered and powerfully built. His dark hair and piercing eyes gave him a striking appearance, while his face carried an expression of constant watchfulness. The younger man supported the older gentleman with great care as they entered the consulting room. It was impossible not to notice the affection he showed. "You believe them to be father and son?" I asked. "I did." According to the doctor, the younger man spoke with genuine concern for his father's health. He explained that the attacks were deeply distressing to witness. Indeed, he confessed that seeing one of them caused him almost as much suffering as the patient himself. There was nothing theatrical in his manner. On the contrary, his concern appeared entirely sincere. I invited him to remain during the consultation. "For Swiffy, what did he decide?" Holmes asked. "He declined immediately." The doctor recalled the moment clearly. He said that watching one of his father's attacks would upset him too greatly. He begged permission to wait outside until I had completed my examination. Holmes slowly nodded. A reasonable request, so I believed. The younger man thanked the doctor politely before withdrawing into the waiting room, leaving the elderly gentleman seated opposite the consulting desk. For some time, the consultation proceeded quite normally. I questioned him carefully regarding his health. The patient answered politely enough, although his replies were often vague and uncertain. At first, Dr. Trevelyan attributed this to the difficulties of speaking a foreign language. He appeared to struggle for the proper English words. The doctor made detailed notes as the conversation continued. I asked about the frequency of his attacks, their duration, and the circumstances under which they occurred. Everything remained perfectly ordinary. Then, quite suddenly, the old man stopped speaking altogether. "I looked up from my notebook," said Dr. Trevelyan quietly, and found him sitting perfectly upright. His face had become completely expressionless. His eyes stared fixedly ahead. Not a single muscle appeared to move. The physician recognized the appearance immediately. He seemed to have entered a full cataleptic seizure. As a medical specialist, Trevelyan's first instinct was naturally to examine the condition before him. I checked his pulse. It remained steady. I observed his breathing, calm and regular. Everything appeared consistent. It were proper's for. He had spent years studying. I considered the opportunity extraordinary. His professional curiosity had completely overcome any initial surprise. Fortunately, he remembered possessing a bottle of nitrite family in his laboratory downstairs, a preparation that had occasionally proved useful in similar cases. I decided to fetch it immediately. The laboratory occupied a room on the lower floor. I believed I should be absent no more than a few minutes. Little did Dr. Trevelyan realized that those few quiet moments downstairs would become the beginning of one of the strangest mysteries ever to arrive at the door of 221B Baker Street. At that time, neither he nor I could yet imagine what had been happening in the consulting room while the supposed patient sat motionless in his chair. Dr. Trevelyan paused for a moment, his eyes fixed upon the glowing embers in our fireplace, as though he were once again standing in his consulting room on that remarkable evening. "The bottle was kept in my laboratory downstairs," he continued. "I expected to be away no longer than a few minutes. As every physician knows, medicines are not always where one last placed them." The doctor searched one shelf, then another, before finally discovering the small bottle tucked behind several larger jars. "It delayed me slightly," he admitted, "perhaps 5 minutes in all." The time, he thought nothing of the interruption. His patient, after all, appeared safely seated in the chair, incapable of movement, while under the grip of a cataleptic attack. Holding the medicine carefully in his hand, Dr. Trevelyan hurried back upstairs. "I opened the consulting room door," he said quietly, and stopped in complete astonishment. The room was empty. Not merely empty of movement, entirely empty. The elderly gentleman who only moments before had sat rigid and motionless had vanished without leaving the slightest trace behind. "I confess," said the doctor, "that for several seconds I believed I had entered the wrong room." He looked instinctively toward the chair where the patient had been seated. It stood exactly where it had always been. His notebook still rested open upon the desk. The pen lay beside it. Everything remained precisely as he had left it. Everything except the patient. "My first thought," he continued, "was that the gentleman had recovered from his seizure while I was absent. Such a recovery was certainly possible. Cataleptic attacks often ended as suddenly as they began. Even so, it seemed extraordinary that a man who had appeared completely helpless could depart without a word." I immediately crossed to the waiting room. There, he expected to find the younger man. Instead, that room also was deserted. The son had disappeared as completely as his father. The doctor rang the bell for his page. The young servant came running from downstairs. I asked whether the two gentlemen had left the house. The boy appeared genuinely puzzled. He replied that he had neither seen nor heard them. Normally, whenever a consultation ended, the page waited below to show visitors to the front door. On this occasion, however, no bell had summoned him, no footsteps had reached his ears, no voices had been heard upon the staircase. He insisted that no one had passed him. The front door, however, told a different story. It had not been locked. Instead, it stood merely pulled to, exactly as though someone had opened it quietly before leaving the house. The entire affair struck me as exceedingly strange. Naturally, the doctor searched the ground floor. Every room proved empty. The street outside showed no sign of the mysterious visitors. London continued its ordinary evening routine. Carriages rolled steadily along Brook Street. Gentlemen returned home from their offices. Ladies entered waiting cabs beneath the glow of the gas lamps. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had occurred. I found myself completely unable to explain the matter. Holmes remained perfectly silent. Only the faint curls of tobacco smoke rising from his pipe betrayed any movement at all. I considered several possibilities, Dr. Trevelyan continued. Perhaps the elderly gentleman had recovered suddenly from his attack. Perhaps his son, seeing him leave the consulting room, had naturally assumed that the examination was finished. Perhaps both had departed together, intending no discourtesy. It seemed the most reasonable explanation. Even so, the incident continued to trouble him. The consultation had been left unfinished. His carefully prepared notes remained incomplete. His patient had received no treatment. Most curious of all, neither gentleman had offered so much as an apology. I expected that perhaps a letter would arrive. None came. I imagined they might return. No one appeared. As the evening continued, the doctor gradually persuaded himself that the matter, though unusual, required no further attention. Shortly afterward, Mr. Blessington returned from his customary walk before dinner. I said nothing to him about my curious visitors. "Why not?" Holmes asked gently. The doctor hesitated before answering. Our relationship had become somewhat distant. Although they continued to conduct business together each day, their conversations had grown increasingly brief. I had learned that Miss Blessington preferred not to be troubled with matters outside his own immediate concerns. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, but did not interrupt. The incident soon passed from my thoughts. Dr. Trevelyan folded his hands quietly. I believed I had seen the last of the supposed Russian nobleman. A faint, weary smile crossed his face. I could not have been more mistaken. He looked from Holmes to myself before continuing. The very next evening, at precisely the same hour, my page announced that the two gentlemen had returned. Little did Dr. Trevelyan realize that their second visit would reveal the true purpose of the first and waken a terror in Mr. Blessington that could no longer be concealed. For a brief while after the strange disappearance of the elderly gentleman and his powerful companion, life at Brook Street returned to its familiar routine. Patients continued to arrive throughout the day. The servants quietly attended to the household. Mr. Blessington resumed his evening inspection of the account books with his usual precision, though Trevelyan noticed that his partner still carried an air of uneasiness that had never entirely disappeared. I gradually persuaded myself, the doctor told us, that the incident had been nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. Holmes gave no sign of agreement or disagreement. He merely listened, his gray eyes fixed steadily upon our visitor. Then, continued Dr. Trevelyan, at exactly 6:15 on the following evening, my page entered the consulting room. The boy announced that the same two gentlemen had returned. I confess, said the doctor, that I was astonished. The visitors entered with the same quiet dignity as before. The elderly man appeared no different from the previous evening. His face remained calm and expressionless, while the younger gentleman supported him with the same attentive care. It was almost as though nothing unusual had happened. Dr. Trevelyan greeted them courteously. Before he could mention the previous day's extraordinary events, however, the older gentleman spoke first. He apologized sincerely for his sudden departure. According to his explanation, whenever he recovered from one of his attacks, his thoughts remained confused for some time. On awakening in unfamiliar surroundings, he had instinctively left the consulting room and wandered into the street without realizing where he was or what had occurred. His son, seeing his father emerge from the room, naturally assumed that the consultation had been completed. Leaving everything to be in order, he simply accompanied him home. It was only later, the younger man explained, that we understood the misunderstanding and realized how discourteous our departure must have appeared. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. "I accepted it without hesitation," said Dr. Trevelyan. "Indeed, I felt rather embarrassed that I had attached so much importance to the affair." The physician smiled gently at the memory. "I assured them that no offense had been taken and suggested that we simply continue the examination where we had left it." Once again, the younger man politely excused himself and withdrew to the waiting room. The elderly gentleman remained with the doctor. This time, however, no seizure interrupted the consultation. For nearly half an hour, they discussed the patient's symptoms in detail. Dr. Trevelyan carefully reviewed his earlier notes, asked further questions about previous attacks, and eventually prepared a course of treatment which he hoped might bring some relief. "When the consultation ended," he said, "both gentlemen thanked me warmly. The doctor himself accompanied them to the consulting room door. Everything appeared entirely normal. They left the house quietly, no mystery, no confusion, no sudden disappearance. The curious incident of the previous evening seemed completely explained. I believed the matter finished." Holmes quietly rested his pipe upon the mantelpiece, but was not. "No." Dr. Trevelyan slowly shook his head. "Not even close." Only a short time after the visitors had departed, Blessington returned from his customary walk. As always, he climbed the stairs to his private rooms before coming down to inspect the day's accounts. Then, quite suddenly, the peace of the house was shattered. "I heard hurried footsteps overhead," said the doctor. A moment later, a Blessington came rushing down the staircase. The doctor described him as a man completely overcome by terror. His face had turned almost white. His hands trembled violently. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts. He burst into my consulting room without even knocking. His first words were not those of an angry businessman, but of a man whose deepest fear had suddenly become reality. "Who has been in my room?" he demanded. Dr. Trevelyan answered honestly. "No one, so far as I knew." Blessington refused to believe him. He insisted that someone had entered while I had been occupied downstairs. His excitement became so intense that the doctor immediately followed him upstairs. What they found there transformed an odd incident into something far more disturbing. Blessington pointed silently toward the carpet. Fresh footprints crossed the floor. They were unmistakably larger than his own. The marks had been left by muddy boots, the rain from earlier that day still clinging to the soles. They could not possibly have been made by Mr. Blessington, said Dr. Trevelyan, nor could they have belonged to the doctor himself. Only one explanation remained. While Trevelyan had been occupied with the elderly patient, someone waiting outside had quietly slipped upstairs and entered Blessington's private room. Nothing had been stolen. The furniture remained untouched. The strong box stood exactly where it always had. Yet the unknown visitor had clearly entered the room and, just as mysteriously, departed again. I cannot adequately describe Mr. Blessington's reaction. The doctor lowered his voice. He seemed utterly broken. The man who had merely appeared nervous a few weeks earlier now looked completely overwhelmed by fear. He sank into a chair, covering his face with trembling hands. More than once, Trevelyan believed he saw tears forming in his eyes. He scarcely spoke. When he finally managed to compose himself, there was only one course of action he wished to take. "He begged me to seek your assistance, Mr. Holmes." Holmes remained silent for several moments. Then, with the faintest hint of interest appearing in his eyes, he reached once more for his pipe. At that time, I could not yet understand what Holmes had already begun to suspect, nor why the mysterious footprints seemed to interest him far more than the frightened behavior of Miss Blessington himself. Dr. Trevelyan's account ended with a quiet sigh. The warmth of her sitting room contrasted sharply with the anxiety that had settled upon his face. Holmes remained silent for several moments, his fingers lightly resting against the bowl of his pipe, while the last curls of smoke drifted toward the ceiling. At length, he rose from his chair. "There is little to be gained by further discussion here," he said calmly. "The matter is best examined where it occurred." The doctor's expression brightened at once. "You will come with me?" "Certainly." He turned toward me. "Watson, if you are willing, I should not think of remaining behind." Within only a few minutes we had gathered our coats and hats. Trevelyan's waiting brougham carried us swiftly through the damp London streets. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving only a thin veil of mist that softened the glow of the gas lamps. Shop windows reflected warmly upon the wet pavement, while the steady rhythm of horses' hooves echoed through the quiet avenues of the West End. For much of the journey, Holmes spoke very little. He sat with his eyes half closed, apparently watching the passing streets without really seeing them. I had often observed this peculiar habit. Whenever a problem interested him deeply, his mind became occupied with arranging every known fact before seeking any conclusion. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. At last our carriage drew to a halt before an impressive house in Brook Street. It was one of those tall, dignified London residences so often occupied by successful physicians. Its broad stone steps rose to a polished front door, while the windows reflected the soft evening light. Nothing about the building suggested mystery or danger. It appeared every inch the respectable medical practice. The page admitted us almost immediately. Dr. Trevelyan led the way through a neatly furnished entrance hall and toward the wide staircase. We had scarcely placed a foot upon the first step when an unexpected voice rang out from above. "Stop where you are." The words were sharp, trembling, and filled with unmistakable fear. The gas lamp upon the landing had suddenly been extinguished, leaving the upper staircase in darkness. "I have a pistol," the unseen speaker cried. "I warn you, I shall use it if anyone comes nearer." Dr. Trevelyan looked upward in astonishment. "My dear Mr. Blessington," he called, "it is only I." For a few long seconds, it was complete silence. Then came a deep breath of relief. "The doctor?" asked the voice uncertainly. "Yes. And are you alone?" "I have brought Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson." Again there was silence. At last the lamp above flickered back to life. Standing upon the landing was a man whose appearance immediately explained the terror in his voice. Mr. Blessington was heavily built, though it was evident that he had once been much stouter, and he was now. His face hung loosely upon his features, giving him a weary and unhealthy appearance. His pale skin seemed almost colorless beneath the gaslight, while his thin, fair hair stood untidily, as though he had passed his hands through it many times. Most striking of all were his eyes. They moved constantly. Even while speaking, it darted toward the staircase, the hallway, and the front door, as though expecting danger from every direction. In one trembling hand he still clutched a revolver. The weapon shook visibly. Only after recognizing Dr. Trevelyan completely did he lower it and slip it awkwardly into his dressing gown pocket. "I beg your pardon," he said, forcing an uneasy smile. "One cannot be too careful." Holmes studied him quietly, without offering any reassurance. "You have been expecting someone?" he asked. Blessington hesitated. I have become rather nervous lately." "So I understand." He stepped aside, inviting us upstairs. His private rooms were spacious and comfortably furnished. The sitting room contained heavy curtains, richly upholstered chairs, and shelves lined with expensive books that appeared rarely opened. A coal fire burned brightly in the grate, yet despite the warmth, the atmosphere carried an unmistakable feeling of unease. Blessington closed the door carefully behind us. Only then did he seem willing to speak. "You have heard about the footprints?" he asked. "We have," Holmes replied. "And about those strangers?" "Yes." Blessington lowered himself heavily into an armchair. "I can't tell you how greatly the whole affair has disturbed me." His voice quivered as he spoke. Holmes remained standing near the fireplace. "I should like you," said he quietly, "to tell me why those men should wish to enter your room." Blessington stared at him. "I have no idea." Holmes did not move. "Are you quite certain?" "Perfectly." There was another brief silence. Then Holmes spoke, in the same calm voice. "My experience has taught me that men are seldom frightened without reason." Blessington attempted a weak smile. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I know nothing whatever about these visitors." For the first time that evening, I noticed a subtle change in Holmes' expression. His eyes remained perfectly calm. Yet I recognized a look immediately. He no longer believed the man before him. The true mystery, I felt certain, had only just begun. For several long moments, no one spoke. The fire burned quietly in the grate, filling the room with a warm orange glow, yet the atmosphere remained strangely cold. Blessington sat heavily in his armchair, twisting his hands together with obvious uneasiness. Every few seconds, his eyes wandered toward the door, as though he expected it to burst open without warning. Sherlock Holmes remained standing upon the hearthrug. His expression was perfectly calm. Those who knew him only slightly might have imagined that he was merely listening with polite attention. I, however, had shared enough adventures with my remarkable friend to recognize the look that appeared whenever he believed an important truth was being concealed. "You tell me," Holmes said gently, "that you have no notion who these visitors may be." "None whatever," Blessington answered quickly. "And yet their actions were directed entirely toward your room." Blessington shifted uneasily. "So it would appear. They entered no other apartment." "No, they stole nothing. So far as I can discover, they searched for nothing. I cannot explain it." Holmes watched him steadily. It is often easier to explain facts when every fact is placed upon the table. Blessington lowered his eyes. "I have told you everything." Holmes slowly walked across the room. Without another word, he began examining the apartment. His method was as quiet and patient as always. He looked first at the carpet where the muddy footprints had been found. Though the marks had faded slightly since the previous evening, enough remained for careful observation. He knelt for a moment beside one impression before rising again. His attention then moved toward the windows. Each fastening was carefully inspected. The newly fitted bolts were unusually strong, far stronger than those commonly seen in London houses. Holmes tested each one gently before turning toward the heavy curtains. "They remain closed throughout the evening?" he asked. Blessington nodded. "Almost always." "And during the day?" "I prefer them partly drawn." Holmes merely acknowledged the answer. Next he examined the bedroom adjoining the sitting room. It was spacious and comfortably furnished. A large bed stood against one wall, while beside it rested a substantial black metal strong box. Without asking permission, Holmes walked directly toward it. "This," he observed quietly, "contains your savings." Blessington looked almost offended. "I do not trust banks." "So your doctor has informed us." Holmes rested one hand lightly upon the lid. "It appears quite secure." "It is. And nothing has been removed?" "Nothing." Holmes continued his slow inspection. Upon a nearby table stood a reading lamp, several newspapers, a medicine bottle, and a neatly folded pair of spectacles. Everything appeared orderly. Nothing suggested the hurried visit of an intruder. At last, Holmes turned once more toward the frightened man. "You have been greatly alarmed," he said. "I have. More alarmed than a simple trespass would ordinarily justify." Blessington swallowed nervously. "I disliked strangers entering my rooms. Most people do." Another silence followed. Holmes's voice remained as calm as ever. "But fear such as yours usually has a cause." Blessington's fingers tightened upon the arms of his chair. "I have already explained everything." "No." Holmes shook his head slowly. "You have explained almost nothing." The words were spoken so quietly that they seemed almost gentle, yet they struck the room with remarkable force. "I beg your pardon?" Blessington asked. "You have described what happened?" "Exactly, but you have carefully avoided telling us why." The man's face became noticeably paler. "I know no reason." Holmes took a slow step forward. "My dear sir, these men visited your private room twice." Blessington remained silent. They risked discovery. No reply. They gained nothing. Still no answer. "And yet you would have me believe that all of this happened without your possessing the slightest idea why." The silence grew heavier. Even Dr. Trevelyan seemed unable to meet Holmes' gaze. At length, Blessington rose unsteadily to his feet. "I assure you," he said, "I have concealed nothing." Holmes regarded him for another moment. Then, to my surprise, he reached for his hat. "If that is your final answer," he said quietly, "there is nothing further I can do." Dr. Trevelyan looked startled. "You are leaving?" "I am." "But surely—" Holmes raised a hand politely. "A physician cannot diagnose an illness if the patient hides half his symptoms." He turned toward Blessington. "The same principle applies here." The frightened man stared at him helplessly. "You advise nothing?" "I advise only one thing." "And what is that?" Holmes looked directly into his eyes. "Tell the truth." Without another word, he walked toward the door. I followed immediately, though I confess I was more puzzled than ever. Dr. Trevelyan accompanied us downstairs. Outside, the cool night air carried the faint scent of rain upon the breeze. Baker Street lay some distance away, hidden beyond the mist-covered streets of London. For several minutes, Holmes walked in complete silence. At last, when we had reached Oxford Street, I could contain my curiosity no longer. "You believe he knows those men?" "I am certain of it." "You found some evidence upstairs?" Holmes smiled faintly. "I found something even more convincing." "What was that?" "A frightened man." I looked at him in surprise. "Surely that proves very little." "On the contrary, Watson." His voice remained calm as we continued our walk beneath the glowing gas lamps. "It proves a great deal." At that time I could not yet understand what Holmes had already concluded, nor how soon the frightened resident of Brook Street would meet fate far darker than any of us had imagined. The night air felt fresh after the uneasy atmosphere of Brook Street. A light mist drifted through the streets, softening the glow of the gas lamps until each seemed surrounded by a golden halo. The steady sound of carriage wheels echoed from distant crossroads, while the city itself settled into the quieter rhythm that always came after 10 o'clock. Holmes walked beside me with his hands clasped behind his back, his pace slow and thoughtful. For several minutes, he remained completely silent. I had learned never to interrupt him during such moments. His mind was arranging every known fact, fitting each small observation into its proper place, before allowing himself to reach a conclusion. At last I spoke. "You are convinced that Mr. Blessington has not been honest with us?" "I have very little doubt of it," Holmes replied. Yet he appeared genuinely terrified. He was terrified. There seemed nothing artificial about his fear. There was not. Holmes glanced briefly toward the row of darkened houses as we continued our walk. "My difficulty lies not in believing his fear, Watson, but in believing his ignorance." I reflected upon the interview, insisted that he had never seen those men before. "Indeed? And you think that impossible?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Consider the facts." He spoke quietly, almost as though thinking aloud. "Twice within 2 days, strangers entered that house. They did. They ignored the doctor's rooms. Yes. They searched nowhere else. No. Their entire attention was directed toward one particular apartment, Blessington's." "Exactly." Holmes allowed a few moments of silence before continuing. "If ordinary thieves had entered the house, what would they have done? They would have searched for valuables." "Quite so." "They would have opened drawers." "They would." "They might even have forced open the strong box." Holmes nodded. "And yet none of those things occurred. Everything remained untouched. The money had not been disturbed. The furniture stood exactly as before. Nothing had disappeared. Their object," Holmes continued, "was clearly not robbery." I found myself agreeing. "Then what were they seeking?" "Not what." He looked toward me. "Whom?" The distinction struck me immediately. "You mean Blessington himself?" "I do." The realization sent a slight chill through me, despite the warmth of my coat. "If that is true," I said, "their first visit failed only because Blessington happened to be out walking." "Precisely." "And during the second visit?" "The same." Holmes's answer came without hesitation. "They searched his room while he was absent." "But why not simply wait for his return?" Holmes shook his head. "Because they had arranged their visit very carefully." He reminded me that the supposed consultation had always taken place at exactly the same hour. The doctor would naturally be occupied. The waiting room would be empty, and the household distracted. It was a clever plan. Exceptionally clever. We walked another short distance before I spoke again. "But surely, Holmes, if these men wished to harm Blessington, they could have attempted it elsewhere." "They could. So why all this elaborate deception?" Holmes smiled. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question." The mist had grown thicker now, drifting lazily across the road, as though London itself wished to hide its secrets beneath a soft gray blanket. At length, I ventured another thought. "There remains one possibility." Holmes looked at me encouragingly. "Perhaps Dr. Trevelyan himself invented the entire story." My companion gave a quiet laugh. "I considered that within the first few minutes." "You did?" "Naturally." The answer surprised me. "What caused you to reject it?" Holmes's expression became thoughtful. "The footprints." I remembered the muddy marks upon Blessington's carpet. "They were genuine?" "Entirely." Holmes continued calmly. "I examined them carefully." "What did they tell you?" "They belonged to a man considerably taller than Dr. Trevelyan." He explained that the impressions differed not only in size, but also in shape. "The doctor's boots are narrow and pointed." "And the stranger's?" "Broad, square-toed, and over an inch longer." Such details had entirely escaped my attention. Holmes smiled. They usually do. So there truly was another man in the house? Without the slightest doubt. We turned into Baker Street, where the familiar windows of our lodgings shone warmly through the fog. There is something else, Holmes continued. The supposed attack of catalepsy. What of it? I do not believe it was genuine. That statement surprised me even more. But Dr. Trevelyan is a recognized authority. Exactly. Holmes nodded. The deception succeeded because it was directed against an expert. I considered his words carefully. You believe the old man merely pretended? I do. Is such a thing possible? Perfectly. Holmes smiled quietly. I have successfully imitated the condition myself. I could not help laughing. I suppose I should no longer be surprised by anything you tell me. There is no mystery in it. He opened the door of Baker Street and stepped inside. The important point is this. He removed his coat before continuing. The old man occupied the doctor. The younger man searched Blessington's room. Both escaped before anyone realized what had happened. The entire plan suddenly seemed remarkably simple. Yet one question still remained unanswered. If your theory is correct, I said, why should Blessington refuse to identify them? Holmes paused beside the fire before replying. Because, Watson, there are some truths that a frightened man fears more than death itself. His words lingered in the quiet room long after he had spoken them. Before retiring for the night, Holmes turned once more toward me. I shall not be surprised, he said thoughtfully, if Brook Street sends for us again before morning. At that time, neither of us realized how tragically accurate his prediction would prove. That evening passed quietly enough. Holmes settled into his armchair with a volume of chemistry upon his lap, though I doubted he absorbed many of its pages. From time to time he rose to place another piece of coal upon the fire before returning to his thoughts. I occupied myself with a medical journal, yet I too found it difficult to concentrate. The strange events at Brook Street lingered in my mind. Before retiring for the night, Holmes paused beside the fireplace. I still believe, he said thoughtfully, Blessington has concealed the most important part of this affair. You expect him to send for us again? I expect something to happen. His words carried no excitement, only quiet certainty. Opening my eyes, I saw Holmes already dressed in his familiar dressing gown. Pale morning light had only just begun to creep through the curtains. There is a carriage waiting below, Watson, he said softly. I sat upright at once. Has something happened? I am afraid so. His face was unusually grave. The Brook Street case. Those 4 words were enough to drive away every trace of sleep. Has Dr. Trevelyan sent for us? He has. Holmes held up a small sheet torn hurriedly from a notebook. Across it, written in trembling pencil, were only a few desperate words. For God's sake, come at once. P.T. There was no time for a longer message, Holmes observed. The writing suggests a man under considerable strain. Within only a few minutes he dressed and hurried downstairs. The cool air of early morning met us as we climbed into the waiting brougham. London looked very different at that hour. The streets were almost deserted. A milk cart rattled slowly through the mist, while a few shopkeepers prepared for the coming day. The gas lamps still burned faintly, though dawn was already beginning to overcome them. Neither Holmes nor I spoke during the journey. His eyes remained fixed upon the passing streets, while the folded note rested quietly in his gloved hand. Our carriage reached Brook Street in remarkably little time. Before the driver had fully stopped, the front door flew open. Dr. Percy Trevelyan hurried down the steps to meet us. I scarcely recognized him. His face had become almost as pale as the morning sky. His hair was untidy, his collar hastily fastened, and his hands trembled so violently that he struggled to hold the door open. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," he cried, "what a dreadful business!" Holmes stepped quickly onto the pavement. "What has happened?" The doctor pressed both hands against his forehead. "Mr. Blessington." His voice almost failed him. "He is dead." Even Holmes paused for a brief moment. "Dead?" The doctor nodded slowly. "He has hanged himself." The words hung heavily in the cool morning air. Holmes neither exclaimed nor questioned immediately. Instead, he studied Dr. Trevelyan's face with careful attention. "When was he found?" "Only a short while ago." The doctor drew a long, unsteady breath. Each morning his breakfast teas carried upstairs by the maid. She knocked several times, but received no answer. And then she entered. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "She found him hanging from the ceiling in his bedroom. I felt a chill, but despite the warmth of my coat, the poor woman nearly collapsed." Trevelyan steadied himself against the stone wall. "The servants are completely terrified." Holmes remained remarkably composed. "Has anything been disturbed?" "No." "The police?" "They are already inside." Holmes gave a slow nod. "Very good." He looked toward the quiet house. "We shall begin there." Together, we entered the familiar hallway. Everything appeared strangely ordinary. The umbrella stand remained beside the door. The polished staircase looked exactly as it had the previous evening. Only the anxious faces of the servants revealed that tragedy had entered the house. As we climbed the broad staircase, every footstep echoed softly through the silent building. Somewhere above us, a door closed gently. No voices could be heard. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath. At the top of the stairs stood the open door to Mr. Blessington's apartment. Holmes paused only briefly before crossing the threshold. Neither of us yet knew whether we were about to examine a suicide or something infinitely more sinister. Holmes stepped quietly into Mr. Blessington's bedroom, and I followed close behind with Dr. Trevelyan. The room was strangely still. Heavy curtains softened the pale morning light, while the fire in the grate had almost burned itself out, leaving only a faint warmth in the air. The silence felt unnatural. A police inspector stood near the center of the room, making careful notes in a small notebook. He looked up as Holmes entered and immediately recognized him. "Good morning, Holmes," he said warmly. "I was hoping you might come." "Good morning, Inspector," Holmes replied. "I understand you have already examined the room." "Thoroughly, as circumstances allowed." The body still hung where it had been discovered. It was a deeply sorrowful sight. Blessington's nightdress hung heavily about him, while the rope stretched upward to a strong ceiling hook from which a large lamp had once been suspended. His face was swollen, and his features bore an expression that suggested great suffering during his final moments. Even after years as an army surgeon, I found the scene difficult to witness. Trevelyan quietly turned his eyes away. "What time do you estimate death occurred?" Holmes asked. The inspector looked toward me. "I should value Dr. Watson's opinion." I stepped forward and conducted as careful an examination as circumstances allowed. "The muscles have become distinctly rigid," I said after a few moments. "Judging from the condition of the body, I should estimate death occur approximately 3 hours ago." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "That would place it somewhere around 4 or 5 in the morning," the inspector agreed. "That corresponds with our own estimate." Holmes remained silent for several moments, simply allowing his eyes to travel slowly around the room. He examined nothing hastily. Every object appeared to receive the same careful attention. The bed stood neatly made, though the blankets clearly showed that someone had slept there during the night. "The impression is quite distinct," Holmes observed quietly. The inspector nodded. "It appears he retired as usual." Holmes continued his slow examination. His attention settled upon the washstand. "There is something here." The inspector walked over. "We found a screwdriver and several loose screws. They rested neatly beside the basin." "No explanation yet?" Holmes asked. "None. The tools seem strangely out of place in a gentleman's bedroom." Holmes looked at them without touching either object. His eyes then moved toward the fireplace. "There has been considerable smoking." The inspector reached into his pocket, produced 4 cigar ends wrapped carefully inside a handkerchief. "I collected these earlier." Holmes accepted them. Instead of merely looking, he raised one to his nose before examining it beneath his small pocket lens. His expression became quietly interested. "Very curious? You noticed something?" asked the inspector. "I noticed several things." He held up the first cigar end. "This one has been smoked through a holder." Then another. "So has this." He selected the remaining pair. "These, however, have not." The inspector frowned. "I had not observed that." Holmes smiled pleasantly. Few people would. He continued his examination. 2 cigars have been cut neatly with a knife." He lifted another. "These 2 have simply been bitten through." I watched him with growing curiosity. "Can that really tell us anything?" "It often tells us a great deal." Holmes placed the 4 cigar ends carefully upon the table. "There were at least 2 smokers." The inspector looked surprised. "You're certain?" "Quite." Holmes continued calmly. "Possibly 3. He walked slowly toward Blessington's writing table. There, resting inside an open cigar case, lay a single unused Havana cigar. Holmes compared it with the discarded ends. "This is a Havana." He gently touched one of the smoked cigars. "These are not." The inspector leaned closer. "What are they?" "A variety commonly imported from the Dutch East Indies." He smiled faintly. "The difference is quite unmistakable." The room fell silent once more. Holmes slowly turned back toward the body. For several long moments he studied the rope without speaking. Then his gaze lifted to the strong iron hook fixed securely into the ceiling. At last he looked toward the inspector. "I trust," he said quietly, "that you are not entirely convinced this is a suicide." The inspector hesitated. "It certainly appears to be." Holmes slowly shook his head. "I believe we are looking at something altogether different." The inspector stared at him. "You mean murder?" Holmes answered in the same calm voice. "Yes." No one spoke. Even Dr. Trevelyan seemed unable to breathe. The quiet bedroom suddenly felt colder than before. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight were beginning to reach the rooftops of Brook Street, but within that silent room, another mystery had only just begun. At that time, I could not yet understand how a few cigar ends, a screwdriver, and several overlooked details had already convinced Holmes that Mr. Blessington had not taken his own life. The silence that followed Holmes's quiet declaration seemed to settle over every corner of the room. "Murder?" repeated the inspector slowly. "Surely that is impossible." Holmes remained perfectly composed. "My dear inspector," he said, "impossible is a word that often disappears once the facts are examined carefully." He walked once more toward the fireplace, where the 4 cigar ends still rested upon the table. "Consider these." The inspector looked uncertain. "I have already explained that they were found in the grate." "Indeed." Holmes picked up one of them. "Yet Mr. Blessington's cigar case contains only Havana cigars." He lifted the case from the table and opened it once again. "You see that the remaining cigar matches neither the size nor the tobacco of these 4. "I believe you are right. Therefore," Holmes continued, The cigars smoked during the night belonged to visitors, not to the dead man. I watched the inspector's expression change. The conclusion was becoming difficult to dismiss. Holmes arranged the cigar ends neatly beside one another. Notice something else. He pointed to the first pair. These have been smoked through a holder. Then he indicated the second pair. These have not. The visitors had different habits, I observed. Exactly. Holmes nodded. And there is yet another difference. He lifted one cigar. The end has been neatly cut. Another, the second, also. Then he held up the remaining pair. These have been bitten through by a man with strong, healthy teeth. The inspector looked thoughtfully at the collection. So, there were at least 2 smokers. Quite possibly 3. Holmes placed them gently back upon the table. No man preparing to end his own life would calmly entertain visitors while sharing cigars. The inspector slowly folded his notebook. When you put it that way, Holmes continued across the room. Our next point concerns the rope. He looked upward toward the strong ceiling hook. You told us this hook once supported a hanging lamp. Dr. Trevelyan nodded. Many years ago, Holmes turned toward the thick coil of rope that rested beneath the bed. You also informed us that Mr. Blessington kept this rope beside him because he feared fire. That is correct. He imagined he might escape through the window if the staircase were blocked. Yes. Holmes rested one hand lightly upon the rope. Then whoever killed him had no need to bring one. The inspector looked surprised. You think they intended to hang him from the beginning? I do. Holmes glanced toward the screwdriver and loose screws upon the washstand. I suspect they arrived carrying some form of wooden support or pulley which these tools were intended to assemble. But they never used it, because they discovered this convenient hook. He pointed quietly toward the ceiling. It saved them considerable effort. The room fell silent again. Every object that had seemed meaningless only minutes earlier was gradually taking its proper place. Holmes then approached the bedroom door. Without saying a word, he removed the key from the lock and examined it beneath the morning light. After several moments, he handed it to the inspector. Do you notice these scratches? The inspector looked closely. Very faint, but quite recent. Holmes traced one mark gently with his finger. A piece of wire has been inserted beside the key, so the lock was forced? Not broken, Holmes smiled, merely persuaded. He demonstrated by turning the key. The door had been locked from inside. The inspector nodded. So it appeared. The visitors opened it from outside with a wire. I began to understand. Then they entered while Blessington slept. Possibly, Holmes considered the matter. Or perhaps they surprised him before he could cry out. He looked toward the heavy curtains and thick carpet. The walls are solid. The inspector agreed. Very little sound escapes this room. So even if he cried for help, no one downstairs was likely to hear. Holmes folded his hands behind his back and slowly crossed the room. I believe 3 men entered. 3? Asked the inspector. The elderly man, the younger companion, and another accomplice whom we have not yet seen. The inspector looked puzzled. What makes you certain of a third? Holmes smiled faintly. The evidence upon the staircase. I recognized quiet confidence in his voice. You examined the footprints. I did. They crossed one another. Holmes nodded. The oldest impressions belonged to the elderly gentleman, the second to the younger man, and the third? Holmes looked toward me, to a heavier individual who followed behind. The inspector stared in astonishment. You can distinguish all that from footprints? My dear inspector, Holmes replied gently, footprints are often more truthful than witnesses. He paused beside the bed. I believe Mr. Blessington was not killed immediately. The inspector looked up sharply. No? Holmes slowly shook his head. No. He pointed once more toward the fireplace. These cigars required time to smoke. His voice remained calm. I think the visitors sat here for quite some while. They talked? I believe so. About what? Holmes looked quietly at the still form lying beneath the white sheet. That, he said softly, depends entirely upon who Mr. Blessington really was. A deep silence filled the room. At that time, neither the inspector nor I could yet understand that Holmes had already begun looking beyond the murder itself to the hidden past of the man who would die within that quiet bedroom. For several moments no one spoke. The inspector stood quietly beside the fireplace, his notebook forgotten in his hand. Trevelyan looked from Holmes to the covered body with an expression of complete bewilderment. As for myself, I felt that the case had suddenly become far deeper than the strange events which had first brought us to Brook Street. Holmes slowly drew the sheet back over Blessington's face with a gesture of quiet respect. Poor fellow, he murmured. Whatever his faults may have been, he spent many years living under the shadow of fear. The inspector looked puzzled. You speak as though you already know something of his past. I know only that he feared these visitors long before they came. Holmes turned toward Dr. Trevelyan. You told us that several weeks ago he became greatly disturbed after reading a newspaper account of a burglary. Yes, he immediately ordered stronger locks. He did. He abandoned his evening walks. For nearly a week, he watched the street from his windows, constantly. Holmes nodded. Those are not the actions of a man frightened by an ordinary burglary. The doctor slowly shook his head. I thought so myself. They are the actions of a man who believes someone has finally discovered where he is. The words seemed to settle heavily upon the room. The inspector folded his notebook. Then you think he had been hiding? I'm almost certain of it. Holmes walked once more toward the large black strong-box beside the bed. It is curious. What is? I asked. A wealthy man who trusts neither banks nor people. He rested his hand lightly upon the lid. He keeps his fortune locked beside his bed. He rarely leaves the house. He fears strangers, and he refuses to explain why. Holmes smiled faintly. That combination is rarely accidental. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. The inspector stepped closer. What do you intend to do now, Mr. Holmes? I intend to discover who Mr. Blessington really was. But surely we already know. Holmes looked directly at him. Do we? The inspector hesitated. Dr. Trevelyan has known him for years, only by one name. Holmes's voice remained calm. A name is easily changed. No one answered. Holmes continued. A man's habits often survive long after his name has disappeared. He turned once more toward Dr. Trevelyan. Has Mr. Blessington ever spoken about his family? Never. Old friends? No. Business associates? None. Previous addresses? I cannot recall him mentioning any. Holmes gave a thoughtful nod. So for years he has lived almost entirely cut off from his own past. Yes. The doctor looked increasingly troubled. I never considered how little I actually knew about him. It is a common mistake. Holmes reached for the framed photograph resting upon the mantelpiece. It showed Blessington seated formally in a high-backed chair. The picture had clearly been taken several years earlier, before anxiety had so deeply marked his face. I shall borrow this, if you have no objection. Certainly, it may prove useful. The inspector looked surprised. A photograph. It is often easier to recognize a face than a name. Holmes slipped the portrait carefully into his coat. I believe Scotland Yard may possess records more revealing than anything found inside this house. The inspector's eyes brightened. "You intend to visit headquarters?" "I do." He gave one final glance around the bedroom. "I have seen everything I need." As we prepared to leave, Dr. Trevelyan accompanied us downstairs. His usually calm manner had almost completely vanished. "I cannot understand any of this," he confessed. "For years I believed I knew the man." "You knew the patient," Holmes replied quietly, "but perhaps not the person." Outside, the morning had brightened considerably. The mist was lifting from the streets, and Brook Street had begun to awaken. Carriages rolled past at regular intervals, servants swept front steps, and shopkeepers opened their shutters as though the city itself remained unaware of the tragedy hidden behind one respectable front door. Holmes paused beside a waiting cab. "Watson," he said, "I have one or two inquiries to make before returning home." "At Scotland Yard, among other places." "Do you expect to identify the murderers?" "I hope to identify someone even more important." "And who might that be?" Holmes looked thoughtfully back toward the quiet house. "The dead man." With that, we climbed into the carriage and set off through the busy streets of London. At that time, I could not yet understand that Holmes was only hours away from uncovering a secret that had remained hidden for many years, a secret that would explain not only Blessington's fear, but the true reason 3 determined men had crossed London seeking him. Holmes seldom explained his intentions while an investigation was still unfolding. During our drive away from Brook Street, he remained unusually quiet, watching the morning traffic as London gradually awakened around us. Delivery carts rattled across the damp streets. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. Our carriage eventually stopped near Scotland Yard. Holmes stepped down with the framed photograph of Blessington cupped carefully beneath his arm. "Will this take long?" I asked. "I hope not, Watson." We entered the building, where several officers greeted Holmes with the respect he had earned through many successful investigations. Though he was not officially attached to Scotland Yard, even its most experienced inspectors had learned that his advice was often invaluable. A clerk accepted the photograph and disappeared into another room. Holmes waited patiently. He never paced while waiting. Instead, he stood quietly with his hands behind his back, observing everything around him without appearing to do so. Only a few minutes passed before the clerk returned, accompanied by an elderly officer whose face brightened with immediate recognition. "I know this man," the officer declared. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "I thought you might." The officer took another careful look at the photograph. "He has aged considerably, but you recognize him?" "Without question." The room grew very still. "He is not Blessington." Even before the officer spoke the next name, I sensed that Holmes had expected precisely such an answer. "This man's real name," the officer continued, "was Sutton." Holmes inclined his head. "Exactly as I suspected." I looked at my friend in astonishment. "So Blessington was only an assumed name?" "It would appear so." The officer placed the photograph upon the desk. "Sutton was involved in one of the most notorious bank robberies of recent years." Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Holmes folded his arms thoughtfully. "The Worthington Bank affair." The officer nodded immediately. "The very same." Although I remembered reading brief newspaper accounts years earlier, many of the details had faded from memory. The officer kindly refreshed them. It was a carefully planned robbery. 5 men had formed the gang. They entered the bank with remarkable precision, overpowering the caretaker before escaping with a large sum of money. Sadly, the caretaker lost his life during the crime. Proving the case proved more difficult than expected. Holmes listened without interruption. The evidence alone was not enough. The officer paused. Then one member of the gang agreed to testify. I looked toward Holmes. Sutton, precisely. The officer nodded. He betrayed the others. The room remained silent. His testimony secured. The convictions. What became of the rest? I asked. One was sentenced to death. The officer spoke gravely. The remaining 3 received long terms of imprisonment. Holmes' expression never changed. And Sutton, he disappeared. The officer spread his hands. Naturally enough. A man who betrays dangerous companions rarely keeps his original name. Holmes looked thoughtfully toward the window. So he vanished, as completely as though he had never existed. The officer smiled sadly. It seems he simply became Mr. Blessington. Everything suddenly began fitting together. The mysterious fear, the locked doors, the nervous glances through the windows, the refusal to speak about his past. For years the man had been living under an assumed identity, hoping the past would never catch up with him. But eventually it had. Holmes thanked the officer warmly before we left Scotland Yard. As we stepped once more into the busy streets of London, I turned to him. So, the 3 visitors, I believe they were the surviving members of Sutton's old gang. They had finally been released. Exactly. And they came seeking revenge. Holmes nodded quietly. Not robbery. Justice, as they saw it. I reflected upon Blessington's terrified expression during our visit the previous evening. Now I understood it completely. He had recognized danger long before anyone else. Every newspaper report, every unfamiliar face, every unexpected knock at the door. Each had reminded him of the secret he had carried for years. He knew they would come one day, I said softly. I believe, Holmes replied. He had expected them for a very long time. The morning breeze stirred gently through the London streets as we made our way back toward Baker Street. Although the dead man's true identity had finally been uncovered, Holmes remained unusually thoughtful. There is still one task remaining, he said. What is that? We know who Blessington was. He looked quietly ahead. Now we must explain precisely how and why. Final meeting in that bedroom unfolded. I had no doubt that Holmes already possessed the answer. He simply wished to arrange every fact before revealing the complete truth. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the morning had given way to a bright but cool afternoon. A gentle breeze carried away the last traces of the fog, and sunlight rested softly upon the rooftops opposite our windows. Miss Hudson had prepared a simple luncheon, but Holmes showed little interest in food. His thoughts were entirely occupied by the Brook Street mystery. Shortly before 3 o'clock, our visitors arrived, exactly as Holmes had anticipated. Inspector Lanner was shown into the sitting room first, carrying his notebook beneath one arm. A few moments later, Dr. Percy Trevelyan entered, looking somewhat calmer than he had that morning, though the events of the previous hours were still plainly written upon his face. Holmes greeted them warmly. "I trust," he said, "that there have been no further developments." "Only one," replied the inspector. "We have found the page boy." Holmes looked pleased. "Excellent. He attempted to disappear early this morning, but was located before he had gone very far." "And what has he told you?" "Very little. He claims complete ignorance." Holmes smiled faintly. "I expected as much." The inspector looked puzzled. "You believe he is lying?" "I believe he knows considerably more than he admits." The room settled into silence as everyone took a seat. The fire burned gently upon the hearth, though it was no longer needed for warmth. Holmes stood with one hand resting upon the mantelpiece, his familiar pipe between his fingers. "I have spent the morning making inquiries," he began. "They have confirmed everything I had begun to suspect last night." Dr. Trevelyan leaned forward anxiously. "Then Mr. Blessington truly was not the man I believed him to be?" "No," Holmes spoke gently. "The gentleman you knew as Blessington once answered to another name entirely." He briefly explained what we had learned at Scotland Yard. The doctor listened in complete astonishment. "So all these years," he whispered, "he lived beneath an assumed identity." The physician slowly shook his head. "I never imagined such a thing. Very few people did. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead." Holmes continued quietly. "The three men who entered your house were not ordinary criminals." Inspector Lanner nodded. "They were seeking revenge." "Exactly." Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "They had waited many years." Dr. Trevelyan looked toward him. "But why visit twice?" Holmes smiled. "Because the first attempt failed." He explained his reasoning carefully. "The supposed attack of catalepsy occupied your attention." The doctor nodded. "Meanwhile, the younger man slipped upstairs. He searched Mr. Blessington's room." "Precisely. But Blessington happened to be out walking, so they found only an empty room." Holmes continued. "The second visit followed the same plan." Again, the elderly gentleman distracted the physician, while the younger accomplice entered Blessington's apartment. "This time, they left something far more important than footprints." "What was that?" asked the inspector. "Fear." No one spoke. Holmes's voice remained calm. "When Blessington saw those muddy footprints crossing his carpet, he immediately understood what they meant." Trevelyan looked puzzled. "They had found him." "Exactly." Holmes nodded. "For years, he had hidden successfully, but now he knew his old companions had discovered his address." The doctor's face slowly lost what color remained. From that moment onward, he knew they would return. The inspector considered this thoughtfully. "So the second visit was only a warning." "I believe it served another purpose as well." Holmes walked slowly toward the window overlooking Baker Street. "They wished to confirm his identity. They had already suspected. Now they were certain." Outside, a hansom cab rolled quietly past the window before disappearing along the busy street. Holmes turned back toward us. Once they knew they had found the correct man, they required only one final visit. A deep silence settled over the room. Dr. Trevelyan spoke, almost in a whisper. "And that visit came last night." Holmes inclined his head. "Yes." His calm gray eyes rested upon each of us in turn. "The events inside that bedroom can now be reconstructed almost minute by minute." He paused briefly. "I believe the entire tragedy unfolded with remarkable precision." As he spoke those words, I realized that Holmes had finally reached the last stage of the investigation. Only one mystery remained. How three determined men had entered the house, confronted the man who had betrayed them years before, and carried out their terrible judgment without leaving behind anything more than a handful of quiet clues. The room remained perfectly quiet as Holmes stood before the fireplace. Outside, Baker Street continued its ordinary afternoon routine. Carriages rolled steadily along the street below, and from somewhere in the distance came the faint ringing of a church bell. Inside our sitting room, however, every eye remained fixed upon Holmes. He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe before continuing. "Let us imagine the events exactly as they occurred." Inspector Lanner opened his notebook once more. "The three men returned during the early hours of the morning." Holmes nodded. "They did not come by chance. Everything had been carefully arranged beforehand." He turned toward Dr. Trevelyan. "Your young page admitted them." The doctor looked startled. You are certain? I am. He insists he knows nothing. Holmes smiled gently. He may not have known their full purpose, but he certainly opened the door. Inspector Lanner made another note. The page disappeared immediately after the murder. Exactly. Holmes continued calmly. Once inside the house, the three visitors climbed the staircase as quietly as possible. He paused for a moment. The elderly man led the way. The younger fellow followed, and the third man walked behind them. I remembered the overlapping footprints Holmes had examined upon the staircase. The order is perfectly clear, he said. They reached Blessington's bedroom and found the door locked. What happened then? Asked Dr. Trevelyan. Holmes lifted an imaginary piece of wire between his fingers. They slipped a thin wire beside the key. The scratches on the lock, I said. Precisely. The key was quietly turned. The door opened. No violence. No broken lock. No smashed door. Everything had been accomplished with remarkable skill. Holmes walked slowly across the room, as though retracing each step himself. I believe Blessington was asleep. Could he not have cried out? Asked the inspector. He may have tried. Holmes looked thoughtfully toward the fire. But 3 determined men can silence one frightened man very quickly. The room grew still. The walls of that house are unusually thick. Dr. Trevelyan nodded. I have often noticed that sounds travel very poorly. So, even had he managed a brief cry, Holmes continued, it is entirely possible that no servant downstairs heard it. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead. Holmes rested one hand upon the mantelpiece. Having secured their prisoner, the visitors did something rather unexpected. They did not kill him immediately. Inspector Lanner looked up. What makes you think so? Holmes pointed toward the imaginary fireplace. The cigars. The inspector slowly smiled. Of course. 4 cigar ends remained. Holmes continued. They belonged to at least 2 smokers. They required time. Exactly. The visitors had seated themselves calmly within the room. The older man occupied one chair, the younger another. The third paced quietly across the carpet. Meanwhile, Blessington remained under their control. Believe, Holmes said softly, that what followed resembled a trial. A trial, repeated Dr. Trevelyan. In their own minds, Holmes spoke without excitement. Remember who these men were. They had spent many years in prison. One of their companions had been executed. Because Blessington had informed against them, the room fell silent once again. It is unlikely, Holmes continued, that they crossed half of London merely to kill him without first forcing him to face the consequences of his betrayal. Inspector Lanner slowly closed his notebook. You believe they confronted him? I do. They reminded him of the past. They pronounced their own judgment. Holmes's voice remained calm. Whatever words passed between them have died forever. Only the quiet evidence remained. The smoked cigars, the chairs that had been occupied, the marks upon the carpet, the rope hanging from the ceiling. Every object told part of the story. At last Holmes continued. When their dreadful meeting had ended, they carried out the sentence they had already decided upon many years before. No one interrupted him. The rope already belonged to Blessington. The hook already stood in the ceiling. The room itself provided everything they required. The peaceful fire crackled softly behind him. There was no anger. No struggle scattered the furniture. No hurried confusion. Only the cold determination of men who believed they had waited long enough. As Holmes finished speaking, an uneasy silence settled over the room. Though the mystery was now almost completely solved, I could not help feeling a measure of sadness for every life that had been touched by the old crime. The brochure The years spent in prison, the long wait for revenge, and finally, that quiet bedroom in Brook Street where the past had returned to collect a debt that had never truly been forgotten. A peaceful silence settled over our sitting room after Holmes finished reconstructing the terrible events in Brook Street. Inspector Lanner slowly closed his notebook. Trevelyan sat motionless in his chair, his expression filled with quiet disbelief. Although Holmes had explained almost every step of the crime, I sensed that both men were still wondering how so many small details could reveal such a complete picture. Holmes seemed to anticipate the question. "My friends," he said gently, "mystery is seldom solved by one great discovery. It is usually solved by many small truths placed together in their proper order." He walked slowly toward the window where the late afternoon sunlight shone softly across Baker Street. "The difficulty in this case," he continued, "is never the murder itself." "It was not?" I asked. "No." He turned back toward us. "The real difficulty was discovering who Mr. Blessington truly was. Now that his hidden identity had been uncovered, every strange event suddenly became perfectly understandable. The newspaper report frightened him because it reminded him that his former companions would one day regain their freedom." Dr. Trevelyan nodded slowly. "That explains why he suddenly ordered stronger locks." "Precisely. Believed they would eventually come searching for him, and they did." Holmes continued calmly. "The anonymous letter was carefully prepared. It appealed directly to your professional interests." The doctor looked thoughtful. "I accepted the appointment without the slightest suspicion, as almost any specialist would have done. Little did I know where Holmes's observations would lead." Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "The supposed Russian nobleman never came seeking treatment. He came seeking information. A younger man entered Blessington's room, not to steal, but to confirm they had found the correct address." Inspector Lanner nodded. "The footprints. They served two purposes." Holmes smiled faintly. "They accidentally betrayed the intruder. But more importantly, they terrified Blessington. The frightened man immediately realized that someone had entered his private room while he was absent. Only someone searching specifically for him would have done such a thing. From that moment onward," Holmes said quietly, "he knew the hunt was over." I remembered Blessington's trembling hands, his revolver, and his fearful glance toward every window. He was expecting death. I believe he was. The room remained silent. Holmes continued. "The second visit accomplished everything the first had failed to achieve. They identified their man. They observed the house. They learned the household routine. And they prepared for their final return." Inspector Lanner looked thoughtfully at Holmes. "The page. Yes, he must have admitted them." "He did." The inspector frowned. "We may never prove it." "Perhaps not." Holmes accepted that possibility without disappointment. "Some men play only a small part in great events." The doctor finally spoke. "There remains one question." Holmes looked toward him. "Why did Mr. Blessington refuse to tell us the truth?" For the first time that afternoon, Holmes' expression softened noticeably. "Because confession would have forced him to reveal the life he had spent years trying to escape." The doctor lowered his eyes. "He was ashamed." "I think so." Holmes spoke without judgment. "He had purchased comfort. He had built a successful practice through your skill. He had hidden beneath another name. But none of those things could erase what had happened years before." The quiet crackling of the fire filled the room for several moments. At last, Inspector Lanner rose to his feet. "You have explained every point that puzzled us." Holmes smiled modestly. "The facts explain themselves. You merely noticed them. My profession has encouraged that habit. The inspector offered Holmes a grateful handshake. I fear the murderers themselves may never be found. Holmes walked with him toward the door. Perhaps, he paused thoughtfully. But men who spend their lives pursuing revenge rarely find lasting peace. As our visitors prepared to leave Baker Street, I found myself reflecting upon the strange chain of events that had begun with nothing more than an anonymous letter and a supposed medical consultation. Behind that simple request had waited an old betrayal, years of fear, and a judgment delayed but never forgotten. Yet one final chapter still remained before the story could truly be laid to rest. After Inspector Lanner and Dr. Trevelyan had taken their leave, a peaceful silence returned to our rooms at Baker Street. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, and its fading light stretched across the carpet before, gradually yielding to the familiar glow of the fire. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm. Carriages passed beneath our windows, newspapers called the evening headlines, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked another. Holmes stood quietly beside the window for several moments before returning to his accustomed chair. "It is a melancholy affair," I remarked. "It is," his answer came softly. "There is very little satisfaction to be found in it." I had seen Holmes solve many mysteries whose endings brought relief or happiness to innocent people. This case was different. Here, justice and revenge had become so closely intertwined that it was difficult to separate one from the other. "The law failed to protect Blessington," I observed. "The law protected him while it could," Holmes replied, "but it cannot erase the consequences of a man's own choices." His words were neither harsh nor sympathetic. They were simply true. The fire crackled gently as evening gathered outside. For a long while neither of us spoke. My thoughts wandered back over everything Dr. Trevelyan had told us. I remembered the anonymous letter, the supposed Russian nobleman, a powerful young companion, the mysterious footprints crossing the carpet, the frightened man clutching a revolver upon the dark staircase, and finally, the silent bedroom where the past had at last caught up with the man who had spent so many years trying to escape it. Little did I know, when that anxious physician first entered our sitting room, how deeply the events of long ago would shape every clue we encountered. Holmes finally broke the silence. "The curious thing, Watson, is that every mystery appears impossible while its pieces remain scattered, and afterward, one wonders how it could ever have seemed difficult." I smiled. "You have often produced that effect upon me." He returned the smile, though only briefly. "It is not cleverness." "What is it then?" "Patience." He rested his pipe upon the mantelpiece. "Every person leaves traces, every decision leaves consequences, and every secret, no matter how carefully hidden, casts a shadow." Those simple words remained with me long after the case itself had faded into history. In the weeks that followed, Scotland Yard searched diligently for the three men responsible for Blessington's death. Every railway station was watched. Every port received descriptions of the fugitives. Officers questioned countless witnesses throughout London, yet the search produced nothing. The three men seemed to vanish as completely as though the city itself had swallowed them. Some years later, I learned that the authorities believed they had escaped England aboard a vessel that was eventually lost at sea off the Portuguese coast. Whether that belief was correct, no one could ever say with certainty. As for the young page who had admitted them into the house, suspicion rested heavily upon him. Yet proof could not be obtained, and without evidence a law could proceed no further. Percy Trevelyan continued his medical career, though I cannot imagine that he ever entirely forgot the extraordinary events that unfolded beneath his own roof. He had entered into what seemed a fortunate business arrangement, only to discover that his benefactor had been living under an assumed name, burdened by a secret carried for many years. The elegant house in Brook Street eventually welcomed new occupants, and before long London spoke of other crimes, other scandals, and other mysteries. Such is the nature of great cities. Yesterday's sensation soon becomes tomorrow's forgotten headline. Yet, I have often thought of Mr. Blessington. He was neither an innocent man nor an entirely wicked one. Fear had become the companion of his later years. Wealth brought him comfort, but never peace. Strong locks guarded his doors, yet they could not secure his conscience. A new name concealed his identity, but it could not erase his past. Holmes once told me that the most dangerous prison is often the one a man builds within his own mind. Looking back now, I believe Blessington began serving his sentence long before the 3 visitors ever climbed the stairs of his house. As for Sherlock Holmes, this case once again reminded me why his remarkable abilities have never been equaled. Others noticed footprints. He noticed where they led. Others saw frightened behavior. He asked what had created that fear. Others accepted a familiar name. He questioned whether it belonged to the right man. That quiet determination to seek truth beneath appearances solved mysteries that seemed beyond the reach of ordinary reason. Even now, as I write these recollections beside another warm fire, many years later, I can almost see Holmes seated opposite me, his thoughtful eyes fixed upon the dancing flames, while London's evening mist gathered outside the windows of Baker Street. Those were remarkable days. Days of quiet observation, days of unexpected mysteries, days spent in the company of the finest detective I have ever known. And though time has carried both the city and its people far beyond that autumn evening, the memory of the resident patient has never entirely faded from my mind. Until we meet again, my dear friend, good night.